Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2022. This is a Star Trek event, obviously, as you could tell from the title, that was created by Vin at Revenant Reads, who's in the middle of a nightmare of putting his house on the market, selling and moving, with himself and his family and all of his books and his rather extensive collection of deadly edged weapons. Which is why you haven't seen, that many Book Trek videos from the guy who started the event. But it's designed to celebrate Star Trek fiction in all of its incredible variety. And we've reduced the event to 2 months for 2022. So August is the Wrath of Book Trek, where we are looking at old style Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry style Star Trek, all of the TV series and the movies up to the dividing line of the J.J. Abrams Kelvin timeline and all of the TV shows by Alex Kurtzman that have followed. So the basic Star Trek, the Star Trek that you would have grown up with, whether it's the original series or Star Trek The Next Generation for a lot of you, or Deep Space Nine and Voyager, or poor Star Trek Enterprise that was not given time to shine. And examining those books. And when we did this last year, I made a decision that I was not going to go back to any old favorites. Anything that I knew so well, read so many times, I thought, what's the point of doing that? Let's explore some of the stuff that you've only read once. Maybe you didn't read it all when it comes to The Next Generation. Maybe you read it quickly. And I had a blast. I learned a lot, including, most importantly, last year, how to appreciate The Next Generation. I learned a lot about how to appreciate the one incarnation of old Star Trek that I didn't really like. And now I do. Now I sort of get it when it's done well. I have not made a similar vow for 2022. I am going to sprinkle in old favorites with less stuff that I'm less familiar with for Wrath of Book Trek. And for today, I decided to go back to printed books, and I went to something that is, I don't know if it's a favorite, but boy oh boy is it old. It is old. I have read my way through, probably no exaggeration, probably 10 copies of this book that are just worn away, just read them until they fell apart. I recently found a like-new condition paperback at the Babel bookshop here in Boston, so I grabbed it. And we're going back to 1971. This is Star Trek IV by James Blish. Star Trek I was James Blish, a science fiction author, science fiction critic, and frequent convention and panelist member. James Blish was given the brief to do written versions of the teleplays for the TV show episodes. And Star Trek I had promotional artwork on the cover from the show, from the TV show. The sort of thing that you would see in a little sidebar in TV Guide. And just a handful of episodes, barely elaborated at all from the screenplay. And it sold like crazy. It dropped into bookstores and pharmacies and drugstores and whatnot with low expectations, because no one had anticipated how hungry Star Trek fans of the original Star Trek, were for anything to do with the show. And by the time this book came out, Star Trek had been off the air for years. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. These things had a guaranteed audience that was ravenous for them. And to Bantam's credit, they started to funnel a little of that money back into the books, because the Star Trek, these mass market Star Trek collections by James Blish, adaptations of the TV show, have some gorgeous cover artwork. I mean, that is beautiful cover artwork. And number 4 is not the only one that has that. The cover artwork is stunning all the way from 2 or 3 to the end of the books that James Blish wrote. A dramatic difference from the other TV adaptation brief that resulted from the original Star Trek, which was Alan Dean Foster, the science fiction author Alan Dean Foster, being given the job of writing up the animated episodes. The covers of the animated episode paperbacks are a scandal in how ugly they are. They're just a bare copy and paste of the Enterprise, no background at all, not even stars. And each volume is just the Enterprise tipped at a different angle. Utterly ridiculous. When there were Star Trek fans out there by the tens of thousands who would have happily given their artwork. They wouldn't have needed any money. They would have signed over the rights to Paramount to just put their artwork on the book. And there still are Star Trek fans like that. What Paramount is thinking, not taking advantage of that, I do not know. I do not know why beautiful trade paperbacks of these books are not in print by James Blish. I do not know why there aren't paperback editions of those Alan Dean Foster adaptations of the animated series with new beautiful cover art in print in bookstores. I have no idea why that is. They would sell. They would sell out. They would become collectible. They'd be selling in dealers' row at conventions immediately. They would make at least 10 times the money that it costs to make them. I don't know. Ordinarily, publishers, and especially movie studios, are a little savvier about that sort of thing, but they haven't done it. And they haven't also done something that I have been calling for 50 years. No offense to James Blish. James Blish was, in my opinion, a workaday science fiction author. I know he has dedicated fans out there for Cities in Flight or A Case of Conscience, but I have read virtually everything that this guy has written. And I do not detect much talent in any of it. I am not springboarding to bash him based on the writing in these books, these particular Star Trek books, because I recognize the limitations under which these were written. He couldn't stray in any meaningful way from the teleplay that he'd been given. He can't have anybody die or change the plot at all. These things have already appeared. He is corseted that way. Now, Alan Dean Foster, I believe, is a much more talented science fiction writer than James Blish was, and he found plenty of ways around that same restriction in his Star Trek logbooks, the books dramatizing the animated episodes. He found plenty of ways to elaborate on those half-hour shows without violating them. The ways exist. And I'm not sure that anybody would really care if you did that now. I don't think the folks at Paramount would care. They've left this whole continuity behind. In fact, executives from Paramount barely ever miss an opportunity to scorn it in public. So they obviously don't care about it, but they still care about money. I have been calling for decades for the people who control these books to say, okay, well, James Blish wrote his short stories. You usually get about 6 or 7 stories in a volume. And they sold well. They made a packet of money, and fans loved them, and they loved especially these cover artworks, you know, the beautiful nature of these things. But let's commission a different writer for every episode and have them elaborate on it. Take the outlandish stuff or the stuff that simply looks weird and put it in the context of broader continuity. Maybe hand those writers a copy of the Star Trek Technical Manual or the Star Trek Encyclopedia in the last edition that it had by Rick Okuda before it went out of print, as if they don't already have those volumes. Let's do one standalone 230-page novel for each classic Star Trek episode and weave in a whole bunch of nuance and drama and texture and atmosphere, the things that are absolutely missing from these adaptations by James Blish. Let's have somebody do that. I feel certain that there are no meaningful legal obstacles to that, and it would make a huge amount of money. Every one of those books would sell out. But that hasn't been done, and doesn't look like it's ever going to be done. So the closest that we're ever going to get is this. And by 1971, when this paperback came out, Star Trek fans that had been there from the beginning were desperate for more. They were desperate for any way to show their love of the show. I was one of those fans, and I ate up these books. I ate them up. I went to the guy who ran the dry goods store, who ran the spinner rack of paperbacks, who came after a while to value my input. He had a paper checklist that came with the 2 boxes of paperbacks that he got every month. He had a checklist of stuff that he wanted maybe to reorder. He used to just not reorder anything. I'll take this. They're going to send me another box in a week or 2 weeks or whatever. I'll just take that. And, you know, if I can return whatever didn't sell the first time, I'll do that. But I'm not going to pay any attention to this. I got a store to run. And I didn't get hired by him. I didn't want to be hired by him. I considered it a major victory that he let my dogs into the store. But eventually we started to talk. He realized that I wasn't a punk, that I might have information for him that he could use. And when we would get a pre-order sheet, and there was Star Trek, anything on it, I would say, you need to order this, and you should order a lot of it, because you're going to sell a lot of it. And you'll miss those sales. You'll just miss that money. It won't go into your register if you don't have it. So when we got a sheet in the mail saying something called Spock Must Die, or something like that, you get a title like Spock Must Die, that guy had no idea who Spock was, and it seemed cheesy. And he's got to check it or not. And do you want the standard 2 copies, or do you want more than that? And he was in a position where somebody, me, was telling him, in the space where you can check, which means you get standard 2 copies, what you should do is put an X and put 20. Put the number 20, not 2, but 20 next to that title. That cheesy title, Spock Must Die. You should put 20 next to that. The first time I told him that, for Star Trek II, I think it was, he said, "Are you out of your mind? I don't want to be stuck with all these books I can't sell. I don't want to be stuck. Where would I even put them? There isn't room for them all." By the time this book came out, he knew that he wouldn't have to worry about where to put the extra copies because they would just keep selling. The space on the spinner rack would be empty every day. And that experience was mirrored all over the country. People, Star Trek fans could not get enough of these books. This thing is like new. Whoever got this in 1971 never read it, which is sacrilege on its own. Although, this isn't great reading. I reread this, the whole thing from front to back, as if I had not read it a million times before. I reread the whole thing from front to back. Didn't take long to do. And for a book trek, I went back to this because I figure I have all these things in mint condition. I might as well read them. And this collection has no duds in the things that it adapts. None. Which some of them don't. Most of them, there are duds in the original series, and there's only so much you can do with it. This has All Our Yesterdays, Devil in the Dark, Journey to Babel, The Enterprise Incident, A Piece of the Action, and The Menagerie. The thing that makes this thing really interesting on its own, one of the only things that does, is that James Blish decided The Menagerie was an original Star Trek movie starring Captain Pike, and Number One, and Lieutenant Spock, Dr. Boyce, and it was a hit at conventions. It was a hit forever at conventions. Fans lined up to see a cut of The Menagerie. But the studio didn't bite, and so Gene Roddenberry had to rework that thing in order to make Star Trek sellable to the studio. And it's taken 50 years, 60 years to get us to the adventures of Captain Pike on the Enterprise. Now we have Star Trek Strange New Worlds. We'll be talking a lot about Star Trek Strange New Worlds next month. But the Menagerie Captain Pike was the first guy that Gene Roddenberry settled on, and a different kind of crew, different kind of makeup, somewhat. And Roddenberry didn't want to waste all of that footage. He didn't want to waste that original adventure. So he reworked it into a 2-part episode for Star Trek, starring his new incarnation of the show, only incorporating the older footage of the show and the tragic fate of Captain Pike and the decision by Mr. Spock to risk court-martial and arrest in order to help his former captain. What James Blish does in this volume is simply write up the adaptation of the Menagerie. He doesn't deal with any of the time of Kirk and Spock. He doesn't deal with any of the flashbacks. Those elements of the 2-part Menagerie Star Trek episode have never been adapted. Never. And that's amazing. That's absolutely incredible, considering how great those contemporary aspects are. Not the cut-up bits of the original show, the original movie, but the writing and the acting that are done in the framework of the 2-parter set later in the era of Kirk and Spock. That has never been adapted, and that's wonderful stuff. You won't get that in this book. You won't get that anywhere. The decision of Spock to steal his immobilized former captain and bring him to the one planet in the galaxy that carries the death penalty if you visit it. The interpersonal drama. The bickering between Kirk and McCoy, where McCoy tells Kirk, "You can't possibly suspect Mr. Spock of being a traitor." And Kirk says, he has the know-how. You don't. If you did, I'd suspect you. I want to get to the bottom of this. Like Kirk says, Uh, in The Man Trap, I don't like mysteries. They give me a bellyache, and I've got a beauty right now. All of that stuff is wonderfully done. And it's not in here. Instead, James Blish decided just to adapt The Menagerie. All the other stories in here are adapted more or less exactly as the screenplays would have them. By the time Blish was on number 4, he was being inundated with letters from fans, but he was also a tried and true hand at doing this. And you can tell. You can definitely tell. What was the first story in here is All Our Yesterdays, where a star is about to go supernova, and it has an inhabited planet in its orbit, and the Enterprise goes there because they've detected a power source, and of course they're worried that there might be people still on that planet. The planet never achieved spaceflight, never became a part of the Federation, but it turns out that the inhabitants of that planet achieved a lot of other technology. They didn't look outward, they looked inward instead, and to the past. And when they knew that their supernova was coming, they all fled into the past of their planet through a time portal called the Atavachron. They could live out their lives. And who would care that in the present their planet is reduced to a cinder? And Kirk and Spock and McCoy beam down to the library of this planet, and they meet a man named Mr. Atos, A to Z, a librarian, who scolds them that you're very, very late. Everyone else has gone through the portal except you. You should pick a time period and go. We don't have much time left. It's 17 hours until the sun blows up. And they have adventures. They accidentally transport themselves into 2 different time periods in the past that just happen to look a lot like Earth. Spare on the sets, use the sets that you have. And I remember watching that episode when it first ran, and I had a million questions. For instance, when Spock and McCoy end up in an Arctic wasteland, and they're about to freeze to death when they are saved by a woman named Zarabeth, who has been sentenced there. She was put through the Atavachron against her will, with just enough equipment to survive in an Arctic wasteland, by a tyrant called Zor Khan, who she was either affianced to or a kinsman of. And she's been there a while, and they have scenes with her. Spock starts to fall in love with her. But what does that story mean? That means the Atavachron predates the awareness of the Nova. It means that the Atavachron has been there all along. There was a tyrant who obviously doesn't exist when Mr. Atos is in his library. There was a tyrant who used to punish people by sending them back into the past. So how long has this technology existed? How long have these people been able to do this? And what stories must be involved there? It's never explained. It's never hinted at all. Instead, it becomes a chase sequence. It becomes a flight to see, can our heroes get back to that library before it's blown up and they don't have a destination anymore? Because once that sun goes supernova, all the people who went through the Atavachron couldn't possibly come back, even if they were physically able. It's a very effective episode, but like I'm mentioning here, there was a lot else going on there that is not explored in the episode, and of course, therefore, it's not explored in Blish's quick, fast adaptation of the episode. And it could have been. There's a lot that you could do here without breaking the continuity of the original episode at all. A later writer does that by saying that Spock and Zarabeth had a kid. But that's not canonical, but you could do a lot that is canonical in here. What adventure of the Enterprises came immediately before this? Where did they come to this planet from? And where did they go afterwards? What effect did it have on Spock? And maybe there are scenes you could add between Spock and Zarabeth and McCoy. I'm certain that there are. I could do it. If I could do it, a whole lot more talented writer could do it. It could be a book, in other words. All Our Yesterdays could be a book on its own. Same thing with the next story. Devil in the Dark introduces an alien called the Horda, silicon-based life. Utterly fascinating. It's an utterly fascinating, heart-touching episode. And the Blish's adaptation does exactly what you see on the screen. He is simply writing he said and she said to the screenplay with nothing else added. A line here or a line there. Barely anything. And as these adaptations go on, I don't think I'll talk about another one for Book Trek, but as they go on, they get a little bit longer. He starts to add in maybe a little scene description. Certainly you won't be fired if you do that. Or a little bit of what's going through the mind of a character, provided it doesn't contradict what comes out of their mouth in a minute. But it's not enough. It's not enough. And I don't believe, even in the 70s, these things came out for the whole of the 70s, 69 to 77, something like that. I don't believe even then that Blish would have been forbidden from doing that. I don't think there was a standing order telling him, don't elaborate. I think it was just that he knew the bare minimum that he could get away with and did it. I don't mean to character assassinate. I never actually met James Blish. But this has all the earmarks of a quick job done for money. I know all about quick jobs done for money. I think I'm in a good position to recognize one when I see it. This has all the earmarks of one of those. So all I could think when I was reading these stories, I mean, it was a blast from the past. It was a tremendous block of nostalgia, not only to reread these stories, but also to read them in this volume. Like I said, I destroyed half a dozen of these things. And also, the whole time that I was reading them, I was replaying the episodes in my mind, as I know the episodes really well. But the Enterprise incident introduces the Romulan commander, who I've talked about quite a bit in connection with Star Trek on this channel. A female Romulan commander who's in charge not just of a vessel, but of an attack group. There's an enormous amount that you could add to the screenplay of that episode without changing the outcome at all. Spock and that commander have many, at least a couple of moments that are not dramatized in the screenplay. You're not offending anyone. Dorothy Fontana is gone. The original scriptwriters for almost all of these stories are gone. Gene Kuhn, Harlan Ellison, Ted Sturgeon, they're all gone. You won't be offending anyone to do it. You could add, and you especially won't be offending them if you keep their scenes intact. And it's not in here, nor is there even a gesture in that direction. What about Journey to Babel, where we meet Spock's parents, his Vulcan father and his human mother, and learn of a long simmering 18-year-old argument between father and son? There are science fiction writers out there, including some very established writers who usually have a big paycheck before you can get them to write a single dangling participle, who grew up on original Star Trek and would write the novel Journey to Babel for free. I don't want to out anybody, but I could name 6 people off the top of my head who would write that novel for free if Paramount would give them the right to do it. It doesn't exist. They don't do it. I don't understand that. You could write a novel of Journey to Babel that would be lovingly annotated. I would love to see annotations. A few of the very earliest Star Trek novels did have footnotes. I'd love to see them come back. Because this is all, unlike Alex Kurtzman's Star Trek, the Roddenberry Star Trek is all about the accumulation of lore. That's what us, the fans who are reading the fanzines like T-Negative or whatever, we love the lore. And we're respectful of it. The trick was to add to the lore without breaking it, without contradicting it. There are writers out there in the world, established writers, who could do that for Journey to Babel at 200 and 300 pages with annotations and a loving introduction. Oh my God, I would love to see that. So my book trek for today was frustrating in a way. It was great to revisit this book. I will definitely end up going back to I have all the other paperbacks. I had them and not have them from time to time. I got the Barnes & Noble leatherbound that collected a bunch of these stories, but in the end I found, just for personal reasons, that I wanted these paperbacks. I just never expected, I found a batch of them in perfect condition at the Brattle. I never expected to see that. So I grabbed them all, and I have them, and they're here to read. They're not here to look at. They're here to read. So I will go back to them, but this Book Trek episode was a lot like yesterday's for different reasons. It was frustrating. It was frustrating for me because I was backseat driving the whole time. I was reading these stories and thinking, oh, come on. I know you're pressed for time and maybe doing the very least you can to get your paycheck, but this scene, you could have added to this scene without changing anything. It would have been fairly easy to do, and you didn't do it ever. You don't do it ever. I started writing scenes like that in my adaptations of these stories. I started writing extra scenes like that. There are plenty of them that could happen and that don't. In Journey to Babel, it is easy to imagine a scene that we don't get in the TV show where Dr. McCoy has an interview, simply a diagnostic interview with Sarek and Amanda. No Spock, no Kirk in the room, and no other reason than to get at what Sarek's medical problem is. But in the course of the scene, McCoy naturally starts to uncover more and more of this deep-seated, painful resentment in Spock's past. Spock, who is a frequent sparring partner of his, but who he likes, who is a close friend of his. That dynamic, so that you realize that you're treading on eggshells here, and you're trying to be a doctor, but you're also curious about a pain that your friend might be in, and maybe even a little voyeuristic about that pain. That there is, in other words, a lot of folded nuance in a single scene like that, and that scene would not affect the continuity of the episode at all. I know that James Blish was not going to do that. Let's just say, I enjoyed these for nostalgia purposes, and unfortunately for you James Blish fans out there, rereading these books never makes me more of a fan of him. They made his own personal economy, but every time I read one of these books, I think about the jobbing science fiction authors working at the time who could have done a better job. For instance, I think, what if Alan Dean Foster had written these books instead of the Star Trek logbooks? What if he written these as well? But a bunch of other people too, not just him. Anyway, it was fun to revisit these. It was interesting. This volume is historically interesting because of the menagerie. Because not only is that dramatized here, but also it underscores the fact that that the menagerie episodes, the two-parter for Star Trek, the original Star Trek's only two-part episode, has never been dramatized. No one's ever written it. And I don't know that I don't know even who you would ask for permission to write such a thing. As far as I know, it's never been done. There might have been one of those photo novels of that episode that would include dialogue, word balloon dialogue that was added for the two-parter, but James Blish never did it, and nobody else ever did it. So it's historically interesting for that. And a piece of the action is, I don't know how many of you are familiar really with the old Star Trek, a piece of the action is comedy. It's Star Trek comedy. Shatner was a hilarious guy. He was often, because of his looks when he was in his leading man phase, he was often cast for dramatic roles, but he was a funny guy and had really good comic timing. And Leonard Nimoy had even better comic timing. It's a shame that they weren't given more comedy to do, but every once in a while they were given a comic episode, and a piece of the action is a terrific comic episode. A classic example of an arrested culture. What do you mean? I had never been arrested a day in my life. It's really, if you haven't seen it, it's really, really good. And the adaptation here just shows that Blish doesn't know how to write comedy. Most science fiction writers don't. He doesn't. And again, I was reading that episode, I was thinking, all right, at the time when you were writing this, in late 1970, so I'm not being, anachronistic here. In late 1970, could Bantam have given that script to a science fiction writer who can do comedy and have him write just that episode? How much better would it have been if the write-up of the episode, A Piece of the Action, should be funny? And it's not in Blish's hands. He had no sense of humor. Whereas, if you had given it to Ron Goulart or John Jakes, it would have been funny. And still stuck to the continuity, still stuck to the script. Anyway, that's enough ranting for now. That is my Star Trek episode for today. Star Trek IV with this beautiful cover. Look at that. Look at the gentle wash of the light on the Enterprise there, the old Enterprise. I wonder what became of the original paintings of these covers. Somebody must have this on a wall somewhere. I hope. I hope that it wasn't on their wall for 30 years, then they had a stroke and then died, and it's in a basement or a garage somewhere. I'm hoping this is proudly displayed somewhere. But anyway, that was, we went back to the past. We went back to a physical paperback and also to a well-known book. And I got that out of my system. So I think for the next couple of days, I will go to other things. To stuff that I haven't read before or stuff that I'm not that familiar with from this original block of Star Trek. Now, yesterday I did Kahless, a novel by Jan Michael Friedman. There was actually a suggestion of Vin at Revenant Reads. He cares very much about his warp nacelle, his wee bairns. He cares very much about his own event. He's just outside circumstances in his life are preventing him from participating as much as he would like to. But that was a suggestion of his. And when I was reading this, I was thinking, all right, enough of the old favorites for the rest of the weekend. But do you have a suggestion? If you've made it this far in the video, I don't know if you have, but if you have made it this far in the video and you have a suggestion, chances are, don't get your hopes up. Chances are I have read the thing that you would suggest. But if you have a suggestion that is encompassed in the spectrum that I talked about, feel free to make it. and I will give it a try for tonight's spin of the wheel for Star Trek. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. All my videos are going long today. I'll try to correct that, but I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.